Here we have RSV4 Aprilia. This bike came in for a few things. It had been sitting for a while, and when it came in, it struggled to start. So getting it, just wouldn't idle properly, idled a bit low, and eventually the idle would come up. Then if you gave the throttle a blip, it would rev up, but then it would almost die and then recover. And it needed a bit of throttle when it was cold to start it. So sort of came in and just to get looked over and see what was wrong with it really. We went over the basics like, fuel system, spark plugs, checking that everything was, all the connectors and all the wiring and all that sort of stuff was routed properly, all the diagnosis stuff, and all that presented as, we weren't able to find anything that, justifying why the idle was so bad. And the other thing about these bikes, because they have their ride-by-wire and they have within the ECU a target idle, what happens is that even if the bike wants to idle lower, the bike will try to recover that itself by opening the throttles a little bit. So that's what was happening. You'd rev the bike, it would die, and then the ECU's correcting that. So then we even did things like we checked the ECU map because the history of the bike wasn't known. So we checked the ECU map, and the map inside the ECU was standard. So it had a standard map in it. And then using our dyno and stuff, we were able to get AFR readings, and the AFR readings were quite rich on idle, extremely rich actually. These bikes out of the box do run rich on idle. This is one of the earlier ones, the RSV4000, not the 1100. Yeah, they do run rich standard, but this was more so. So, it was interesting, and then so we just did a little test in the idle area, just lean off the map, and sure enough, the bike responded and it idled better, and it almost didn't want to die. But so you might go, so there's some, trains of thought of people out there might go, okay, it just needed the map to be changed. But the question is why? Like, why should you need to make an adjustment like that? If everything mechanically is okay, the fuel system, throttle bodies, ignition coils, spark plugs, we checked all that. And everything that makes the motor run was okay. Sure, it's got an exhaust system on it, whether some of these Aprilias, they have just a slip-on or a full system. There isn't a lot of difference in the fueling between those two on this particular model. But even that, having a full system, like bike like this, isn't enough to make it idle or warrant the way it was idling, or warrant the fueling change we needed to do on idle. So as I was saying, there's some trainer to put forward or some people out there and they would go, oh yeah, that fixed it, resolve the problem, move on. You have to understand why those things are happening. So the next part of that was like, okay, well, I just want a tune assessment. Customer wants a tune assessment, wants to know how it's running. And we were very reluctant to run this bike on the dyno, simply based on there is something we're not understanding about this bike. We've checked all that stuff, and it was thought to be that the mechanical platform underneath the bike is A-OK, but something's telling us that something's not right. So because we'd ruled out all the auxiliary units, everything that we went through, all the diagnosis, it was pointing to, it must be something mechanical that's causing this issue. We went back to the customer to say, there's something that's concerning us about this motorbike. Part of it could be seen in the past, because we do a lot of race bikes and history of racing, modified engines. Sometimes if the cam timing or the valve timing is off, or slipped a tooth or stuff like that, it will affect the idle. Because the way that, on the small throttle or partial throttles, the engine can't breathe properly or it's not fueled properly. A lot of time too much of the fuel mixture is going in the exhaust instead of the combustion chamber if the valve timing's off and the bike won't idle properly. That's why in some performance bikes or cars on idle, you hear them, they've got a lumpy idle. It's because they can't actually run properly on idle. But this bike is essentially, other than having an exhaust and a filter, pretty much standard, and it shouldn't have idled the way it should. So we went looking further, and what we found was interesting. Because we wanted to check the cam timing and valve timing to make sure that was all okay, it was A-OK, and then while we're there, we'll check the valve clearances. And on this bike, a few of the valve clearances were ginormously out. They were actually closed up. How they got that way, we're not sure yet. We know that there were signs that someone has been inside the rocket covers and potentially has adjusted these valves before. Like we said, the customer didn't know the full history of the bike, but there were a number of valve clearances that were way, way, way out of spec, completely closed up. So much so that we couldn't even get readings on them, and we had to do a few goes to get the valve clearances right. Once we got the valve clearances sorted out and in spec, lo and behold, the bike idles properly. That extremely rich behavior on idle's gone, and we put the original map into it, not the one that we modified, and it idled normally, behaves normally. When you give it a blip on the throttle, it comes back down to idle as per normal and behaves like a normal RSV4. So at that point we go, okay, now we're confident to run it up and do a dyno assessment of the tune. So just a really interesting case, because sometimes you may feel like, oh, that's running rough, my bike needs a tune up, and you tune it, or what people perceive as it needs a tune, and you go into tuning through the ECU or putting a fuel map in it. There needs to be a reason why you're doing that, or you need to have the mechanical platform underneath. Like I said, it's pretty much standard. Yes, it's got a full system and an air filter, but it's nothing major. It should still run with a standard map in it. So if you've got a bike that's not running properly at all, and it doesn't have massive modifications, it's not necessarily needing a tune, like a custom tune to fix it. It should run okay with all the base equipment. And yes, a tune will make it better, but it shouldn't make it the way that it was. So just a really interesting case. Glad that we went through it that way, because with the valve clearances the way they were, if this bike was run on the dyno, it would have likely hit a valve on the piston and destroyed the engine. And if it didn't do it then, if this is a track bike, it was only going to be a matter of time before it did it on the track, because it actually had no valve clearances on a number of cylinders, and it was about to be a disaster. So just an interesting case, and yeah, thought we'd share that.